The whiskey glass shattered against the parquet floor of the Edmund Grand's 41st-story ballroom, and $200 worth of 25-year Macallan spread like amber blood across Vittorio Alcantara's charcoal trousers, because Verity Sheridan's forearm had swept it there, on purpose. In the single second her nose told her what was wrong with it. She had maybe 3 seconds of silence before everything collapsed. Nicolette Leroux's voice cut through the room like a blade. She threw it at him. I saw her. She's been hovering around this table all evening. Tabor, get security, get her away from him. She put something in that glass. 200 heads turned. Verity was already on her knees, her white uniform blotched with whiskey, one palm pressed flat against the wet parquet to keep herself upright. There was a shard of crystal embedded in her left hand. She didn't feel it yet. I didn't, she started. Don't you dare speak, Nicolette said. Her voice dropped to something cold and precise. She was wearing a dress the color of winter ice, and she was perfectly, devastatingly beautiful standing above Verity, looking down. Don't you dare open your mouth. Look at you. And you thought, what exactly? That you belonged at this table. In the world of Toronto's financial and criminal elite, the penthouse galas, the private floors of the Edmund Grand, the fundraisers where senators and syndicate bosses attended the same cocktail hour. Verity Sheridan was functionally invisible. That was not a metaphor. It was a deliberate social mechanism, and she had come to understand it the way you understand weather. Not something to fight, just something to account for. She was 26 years old, 5'4", and weighed 270 pounds in her work shoes. She wore the hotel's white catering uniform in a size 22, and the jacket pulled slightly at the shoulders when she reached across a table, and she had stopped caring about that particular detail sometime around her 3rd month on the job. She was not the kind of woman people saw in rooms like this one. She was the kind of woman whose hands they noticed when a glass was refilled, when a plate was cleared, when a candle was straightened. The hands arrived, the hands departed. Nobody looked at the face they belonged to, which in her experience was mostly fine. She had grown up in a small town outside of Thunder Bay, in a house that shared a property line with her grandmother's garden. Her grandmother, Edna Sheridan, had been one of those women who knew the name of every plant that grew within 50 kilometers and what each one would do to a body, good or ill. By the time Verity was 10, she could identify water hemlock from sweetgrass, from wild bergamot by smell alone. By 15, she could tell the difference between the dried flower scent of chamomile and the sharper synthetic edge of a chamomile flavoring in a store-bought product. She had a nose her grandmother called a gift, and most of her co-workers at the Edmund Grand called strange when they thought about it at all. The gala tonight was for Vittorio Alcantara. She knew who he was the way every server in the hotel knew their guests. From the pre-shift briefing, from the security walk-around that added 4 additional personnel to every floor when he was in the building, from the way the general manager personally verified the table placement twice. Vittorio Alcantara, 43 years old, ran the largest private logistics network between the Great Lakes ports and the St. Lawrence Seaway. That was the public version, the one that circulated at the service entrance, passed between servers with the practiced casualness of people who knew not to repeat it, was that his network moved considerably more than commercial freight. He was celebrating a new arrangement with the Montreal Consortium, and the Edmund Grand was where Toronto's power made its agreements official. He was tall, with the kind of posture that took decades to build, unhurried, taking up space without performing it. When he arrived at his table and found his chair's position slightly off from the room's sightline, he had moved it himself, then looked directly at Verity when she offered to help. "Thank you," he had said, not at her hands, at her. She had thought, this one is different. Nicolette Leroux, who arrived on his arm 6 minutes later, was not. She was from one of Montreal's oldest crime families, a strategic match by anyone's measure, and she moved through the room like a woman who had never once been uncertain about her right to exist in it. She was slim and polished, and wearing something that probably cost more than Verity's monthly rent in Scarborough. She had snapped her fingers at Verity twice during the first hour of service to request items she could have simply asked for. She had called her "you," the large one, in front of 3 other guests when she wanted her champagne flute topped up. Verity had done it. She had said, "Of course, Miss Leroux." She had not said anything else. Her job was to be invisible. She was very good at her job. The whiskey course came at 11:45. The 25-year Macallan had been in the hotel's secure reserve since the day prior, never leaving the locked temperature cabinet except to travel directly to the service station under Verity's supervision. She had decanted it herself, wearing gloves following protocol exactly. But at some point the decanter had been in the prep corridor behind the brass screen, and Verity had been sent to the far end of the room at exactly 10:43. She could clock it now with excruciating clarity, because Nicolette had raised her hand and said the elderflower cordial at table 9 smelled off. It did not smell off. Verity had checked it herself upon returning. The cordial was fine. She had been gone for 11 minutes. When she came back, Nicolette was no longer near the prep corridor. She was at the head table, her hand resting on Vittorio's arm, laughing at something a Montreal associate had said. Verity had picked up the decanted Macallan and carried it to the head table without a second thought. She was reaching past Vittorio's left shoulder to place the poured glass in front of him, the amber liquid catching the chandelier light beautifully. When she inhaled, as she always did near fine spirits, out of simple professional habit, her hand stopped. The Macallan smelled of toffee and dried fruit and oak, exactly as it should. But underneath that, almost hidden in the heavy alcohol vapor, something else was there. Something her grandmother had spent 3 full summers teaching her to recognize without hesitation, because hesitation could cost you a life. The faint, root-cellar sweetness of water hemlock, Cicuta douglasii, one of the most toxic plants on the continent, growing freely along the lakeshore trails east of the city. Its extract produced cicutoxin, seizures, cardiac arrest, death, typically within an hour of ingestion. Her grandmother's voice, "If you ever smell that in something a person is about to drink, you do not wonder, you do not wait." Verity's forearm came forward. The glass went over the edge of the table. The sound of it hitting the floor was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Vittorio was on his feet immediately, not from shock but from the trained instinct of a man who had survived long enough in dangerous rooms to react before he understood. His eyes dropped to the floor, to the spilled whiskey, to Verity already on her knees. "What happened?" His voice was even. Then Nicolette's was not. By the time she finished, she had accused Verity of obsession, of deliberate sabotage, of harboring a delusional fixation on a man so far above her station it would be laughable if it weren't so dangerous. She said she had been watching Verity hover around the head table all evening. She said she had seen Verity's hand near the decanter. She said the whole thing made a terrible, obvious kind of sense. A woman like this, invisible in a world that would never want her, quietly resenting the people around her until the resentment curdled into something violent. It was, Verity would think later, a masterpiece of a lie. It took every true thing, her size, her class, her invisibility, the total imbalance of power in the room, and stitched them into a narrative that felt inevitable. Of course, this is how these things happen. Look at her. "I didn't touch the decanter outside of protocol," Verity said. "The whiskey smelled wrong. There's something in." "She smelled it." Nicolette's voice went theatrical with contempt. "That's her defense. She smelled it." Then Nicolette stepped forward and slapped her across the face. The crack of it went through the nearest circle of guests like a dropped plate. Verity's vision went white at the edges, and she pressed her bleeding hand to the floor to keep from tipping sideways. "Tabber," Vittorio said. His head of security, a broad-shouldered man who moved like a building shifting, crossed the floor in 4 steps. He did not ask Verity to stand. He took her by the arm, hauled her upright, and steered her toward the service corridor without once looking at her face. "Wait, the whiskey, please, you can't let anyone." "Move," Tabor said. The last thing she saw before the service door swung shut was Nicolette smoothing her ice-colored dress over her hip and murmuring something to Vittorio with the practiced expression of a woman who had just managed something unpleasant. They locked her in the hotel's lower-level boardroom. Not a dungeon, the Edmund Grand was a 5-star property, but the effect was similar enough. A closed door, a turned lock, the particular silence of a room underground. She sat at the long conference table and looked at her hand. The cut from the crystal was deep and straight across the heel of her palm. She wrapped a table napkin around it, held pressure, and tried to stop shaking long enough to think. Nicolette had sent her to table 9 at 10:43, 11 minutes. That was enough time if you had the compound already, in a vial, in a clutch purse, in a pocket, to add it to a poured glass and step away. Sycotoxin in concentrated form required extraction, real extraction, lab equipment, or a skilled chemist. The Leroux family ran their operations out of Montreal and would have access to pharmaceutical-grade chemistry. But Nicolette had arrived in Toronto yesterday. She had not brought a chemist with her on that kind of timeline. She had arranged for one here. And then Verity remembered something she had let slide past her at 9:30, near the service corridor. Nicolette's voice from behind the brass screen, low and quick. "Has it handled? The arrangement is confirmed." And then something else Verity hadn't caught, because it wasn't her business. She had assumed it was event logistics. She understood now that it was not. She didn't know how long she sat in the boardroom before the lock turned. When the door opened, it was not Tabor. Vittorio Alcantara stepped in alone. He set a glass of water on the table in front of her and sat down across from her, and he looked like a man who had recently received information that he was still processing at speed. "My dog was in the ballroom tonight," he said. "Kodiak. He goes where I go. He's trained, but he's got no discipline around spilled food." A pause. He got to the whiskey on the floor before anyone could pull him back. Verity felt her stomach drop. "Is he?" He had a seizure 9 minutes after, convulsive. Vittorio's jaw was tight. "He's alive." The hotel vet got there in time. It was close. The silence between them was very loud. "I didn't put anything in that whiskey," Verity said. "I know." He said it without softening, without hesitation. A plain statement. "The service corridor footage goes back 4 hours. You were never near the decanting station outside of a protocol window. When you were at the station, a floor manager was present. When you weren't there, someone else was." He placed both hands flat on the table. "Nicolette was at the prep corridor for 85 seconds while you were at table 9. There is no floor manager visible in frame for those 85 seconds. She sent me to table 9. "Yes." The cordial there was fine. "I assumed it was." She looked at the napkin wrapped around her hand, the red seeping through. "The compound I smelled. I need to explain it properly. It matters." He nodded once. He was the kind of man who listened without filling the space. She told him everything. Her grandmother, the Northern Ontario garden, learning every plant that could heal and every plant that could kill before she was old enough to drive. The base scent of the whiskey had been clean and correct, but underneath it was a root cellar sweetness that was unmistakably cicuta, water hemlock, native to the Ontario lakeshore, and sycotoxin in concentrated form required specific preparation. not home chemistry. Lab equipment. And then the second thing, the detail she'd been turning over since the boardroom door closed. There was a synthetic base note underneath it, she said. Sharp, antiseptic, pharmaceutical-grade ethanol, or something close. The kind of solvent that comes from a proper lab setup. She paused. The Leroux family imports from Quebec, but Nicolette arrived yesterday. She couldn't have brought a chemist on that kind of timeline. She arranged for one here. Someone local with lab access and a reason to want you gone. Vittorio went very still in his chair. There was a man at the pre-event dinner last night, he said slowly. Nicolette introduced him as a wellness consultant. Something moved across his face. Not anger, not yet, but the cold reorganization of a man remapping everything he thought he knew about the past 24 hours. She said the arrangement was confirmed. At 9:30, Verity said, by the service corridor. He stood up. He moved to the window that looked out onto the underground car park. There was nothing to see there, but she understood it wasn't about looking. It was about standing while he thought. The Leroux family wanted this alliance, he said, mostly to himself. Richard wanted it. He said it directly to his son at the pre-dinner. This marriage was the peace arrangement between the Montreal Consortium and my network. He stopped. If I die tonight, Richard Leroux is positioned to absorb the Great Lakes roots under the pretense of maintaining order, but he gains nothing clean from it. The Montreal Consortium is his competition. He turned back. She made a side deal. Someone in Montreal has been waiting for the Great Lakes routes to open up, and she was going to hand them over the moment I was in the ground. And blame the server nobody was ever going to look at twice, Verity said. Something crossed his face that she couldn't quite name. He crossed back to the table, sat down, and reached for her bandaged hand with both of his. Let me see this properly, he said. They went upstairs together, and not through the main ballroom. Vittorio knew this building, the way men like him knew every building. The service routes, the private floors, the elevator that bypassed the public areas entirely. The gala had been quietly ended in the 12 minutes between leaving the boardroom and returning. What remained was a smaller group on the 40th floor in the hotel's private meeting room. Richard Leroux, grey-haired and rigid in his chair. His son Julien standing at the window, arms crossed. Commissioner Fortier, the commission's representative, sitting very still in the corner, with the expression of a man reserving his conclusions. Nicolette at the center of the table, with a glass of water, and perfectly arranged posture and red-rimmed eyes that had been performing grief since the moment the gala ended. She saw Verity step out from behind Vittorio's shoulder, and her face changed completely, the grief dropping away like a coat off a hook, leaving something flat and cold underneath. Why is she still here? Nicolette said. Not a question. Because we are not finished, Vittorio replied. He didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table and laid it out. The security footage timestamps, Kodiak's collapse, the veterinary documentation already being processed, the 85 seconds, the absence of a floor manager in frame. Nicolette's response was polished and fast. Verity had tampered with the decanter. Verity had been obsessed with Vittorio all evening. A woman like her, invisible and overlooked, slowly curdling. It was obvious, wasn't it, to anyone who had looked at her carefully. She worked the table next to mine for 4 hours, Vittorio said. I know what distracted service looks like. She wasn't distracted once. He turned. Tell them, Verity. And Verity, in that room full of people who would have filed her under irrelevant on any other night of her life, stood up straight in her stained uniform and spoke clearly. She laid out the botany, the cycutoxin, the extraction method, the pharmaceutical-grade solvent underneath the smell of it, what it required to produce, lab access, prior chemical knowledge, an arrangement made in advance. She described the conversation she had overheard at 9:30, the time, the specific words. Commissioner Fortier leaned forward very slightly. "We detained a man at Pearson earlier tonight," he said. "Belgian national, chemistry background, rental car, flight booked for 12:30. He looked at Nicolette without particular expression. He identified his client before we finished asking." The room was silent. Richard LaRue turned in his chair to look at his daughter, not with horror, not with grief. With the cold, evaluative gaze of a man who ran an organization, looking at a liability that had acted outside its authority. "You did not clear this with me," he said. "Papa. You made a private arrangement with a Montreal faction." His voice was level and completely final. "You were going to hand over the Great Lakes network. You were going to use this man's death." He stopped. He turned back to face the table. "You are no longer a LaRue in any capacity that matters to this room." Julien stepped away from the window. He did not look at his sister. He moved to stand beside his father. Nicolette's composure broke in a single visible seam. She reached across the table for the letter opener sitting near the notepad, and Tabor moved faster than Verity would have believed possible. His hand clamped down on Nicolette's wrist. The force of the stop sent Nicolette hard against the arm of her chair, and the sound she made was not beautiful at all. Richard and Julien LaRue walked out of the room. Commissioner Fortier nodded at Tabor and followed. The room was very quiet. Verity's adrenaline left her the way it does, all at once without warning. She sat down into the nearest chair because her legs had simply made that decision for her. Vittorio sat across from her, close, not at the other end of a long conference table. "Why did you do it?" he asked. "The glass, the whole evening, all of it. You knew the second you knocked it over that Nicolette would come for you. You knew how it would look. Why risk it?" She was quiet for a moment. She had a grandmother's voice in her head, and a cut hand wrapped in a borrowed handkerchief and a bruise forming along her left cheekbone, and she was very, very tired. "My grandmother taught me that you never ignore what your nose tells you," she said, "and that you never let someone die if your hands are close enough to stop it." She looked at the table. "You moved your own chair that first hour. You looked at me when you said thank you. That sounds like a small thing." She met his eyes. "In this kind of room, it isn't." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "I am not a good man by any simple measure," he said. "You should know that clearly." "I know what you are," Verity said. "I've served this kind of room for 3 years." "Then why?" "Because you were decent," she said. "Some people are and some people aren't, and I've never been able to pretend I can't tell the difference." He looked at her, not past her, not through her, not at the table or the room, or some middle distance where she became background. He looked at her the way she had looked at him, once, when he was just a name in a briefing, and she was still deciding what she thought, with a tension that was real. "I need someone who does what you do," he said eventually. "Not serving drinks. Someone who can assess what enters my events before it reaches a table. Someone whose instincts I can trust." A pause. "I imagine that would pay considerably more than what the Edmund Grand is currently managing." She looked at him for a moment. Her hand throbbed. Her cheek throbbed. She thought about her apartment in Scarborough and the phone bill she'd been moving around for 6 weeks. "I want it in writing," she said. Something crossed his face that was, she was almost certain, the beginning of a smile. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tonight." He reached out and took her bandaged hand, carefully, and turned it palm up to check the napkin. His hands were large and warm, and he held hers like it was something that mattered what happened to it. "Tonight we get this scene to properly." 3 months later, Verity Sheridan sat in the small courtyard garden of a house she had moved into in the annex, on a Sunday morning in October, with a mug of coffee and a 5-month-old shepherd mix named Cedar, who was very seriously destroying a chew toy of no monetary value. Her new position had a title, Director of Event Security, Alcantara Group, and a salary that had made her go quiet for a full minute when she first saw the number. She assessed every private event, every catered function, every delivered product. She had also, in the past 3 months, quietly reorganized the entire beverage procurement system based on provenance tracking. A proposal Vittorio had approved in under 10 minutes and described, with the particular reserved expression she was learning to read, as the most efficient operational update since the new freight routing the year prior. She had not mentioned that she'd first suggested the system to the supply manager informally, weeks before it crossed his desk. He had figured it out anyway. Cedar abandoned the chew toy and came to rest her chin on Verity's knee with the gravity of a dog who had decided this was now her primary occupation in life. Verity heard the back door open behind her, the specific, unhurried weight of his footsteps on the stone. Vittorio sat down in the other chair. He had a coffee. He looked at Cedar with the expression of a man who had accepted that there was now a dog in his life and was finding this, against his better judgment, a not entirely unwelcome development. She destroyed the other one, he said. She's efficient, Verity said. He reached over and set his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. She turned her palm up and held it. The October light came through the ginkgo tree at the back of the garden in long, thin pieces, and the city was quiet on a Sunday at that hour, and Cedar sighed enormously against Verity's knee. Some things, it turned out, were simpler than you were told they would be. The hard part was surviving the night that changed them. Everything after that was just learning the shape of the new world you found yourself standing in, and Verity Sheridan had always been very good at that.